We used to burn the woods for the heat and for the stove, for the kitchen. Oak. Like monks, the choir monks all winter worked in the woods, cut down trees and then cut it up into 4-foot lengths. And then burned that for heat and for the steam. Well, then that was finally changed to oil or coal. And then we forgot all about the woods. So they were neglected, and that bothered him. Tried for years to get people interested in it, but nobody took him up on it. Today they do. It's come around. He had little love for machinery, and the sound of the tractor in the bottoms roused no poetry in him. He could be quite grim about poisons and sprays, what these things did or might do to wildlife. Basically, his views of the world of agriculture was more that of a poet than that of a farmer. And the response of the farmers was obvious. There's no money in poetry. However, even farmers are aware that there are many sins against God in the world God made, and he would point that out. Violence to nature, to him, was a distortion of, as is violence against man. The distant boom of the guns in Fort Knox, to him, was not much different from the noise of the tractors in the middle of the night, or a bulldozer moving the creek down below. The creek ran through the middle of the field, and the brothers pushed the creek over to the side so they have a clear field. He thought that was outrageous. He was not anti-machine in the final analysis, because he realized what they could do. He admired a good typewriter and was aware that the later ones weren't as good as the old ones. He admired brothers who were craftsmen, could make wonderful things, had many friends who were artisans and craftsmen. Being agrarian in spirit, he was not charmed by monastic industries, by which we support ourselves. He was almost unkind in his comment on our cheese and fruitcake business. He could get eloquent on that. The assembly line in the monastery, production control. The complex remains, of course, and will remain, but it is modest and is well in hand, and much of that may be laid to him, that it didn't get out of hand, which usually happens in the monastery. Well, it's the American thing. If you're not growing, you're dying. And they keep asking us, why don't you grow? We don't want to grow. If we grow, we lose control of it. And then it isn't ours anymore. So we keep it where we want it, within a certain limit. Then it's ours. Otherwise, you hire people to do your work, and you lose it then. Many of the monasteries have done like in Europe with many of their products. They lost them. Well, he was influential in developing that philosophy. He was a monk among monks. No one made anything of him. He didn't expect special handling, and he didn't get it. That does not mean that he adopted some sort of humble manner by which he hid his own importance. No, he was himself, very much alive and very real. When you met him, spoke with him, had dealings with him, you never felt you were dealing with something artificial. Quite the opposite. He was nothing if not real. And part of that reality was his simplicity, being himself. He said what he thought, and he did what he thought should be done. That was all there was to it. And what he said and did was rooted in love for God and for man. No one here ever thought of him as famous, or thought of him as a great author, or a renowned personality. The basic reason for that was he himself didn't think so. He didn't make a big thing of his writings. Once they came out, he never looked at them again. He didn't go out of his way to be humble about them, to speak disparagingly about them, except a couple of them that he thought were poor work. He simply didn't see them in that light. He knew he was a writer. He knew he was successful. He knew he had a name. But to him, making something of that would be like a priest making something of himself, because he's a priest. Indeed, as with his priesthood, he saw the whole life as a calling from God, and as one bound to answer that call faithfully. Calling didn't make him It was how he responded to the call, and he tried to answer it as best he could. So, in other words, the response that we made to him wasn't artificial. We just treated him as he treated himself, one of the monks. Yeah, besides he was very sick, he had a miserable stomach, or tight intestines. A lot of trouble with that. Never complained about it, though. One of the brothers told me, I asked him once, how's the food? Well, so-and-so was the cook. What he says sometimes is pretty grim. In fact, sometimes I can't eat it because he gives me things he knows I can't eat, like milk or cheese or something. And then I met the brother one time. I says, what's he like to cook for? Wonderful. Never complains. See, in other words, Merton would be honest enough to tell you if you asked him, but he wouldn't be going all through the community telling what a creep Brother Wilfred was. He was a lousy cook, you know. He never said a word. And when Brother Wilfred himself, he said he never complained, never complained. And I'm sure that's true. You know. Yeah. In the matter of his becoming a hermit was particularly persistent and courageous. Looking back at it, it's really wretched. It took years and years of patient effort. Working it out, he literally had to move mountains of opposition. He certainly wore them down by prayer and by patience. It's so easy today, but in those days it was a long while coming. Monks were never really keen on the whole hermit thing. Some were enthusiastic, and some took exception to the whole business. The majority simply accepted it as one of those things, you know. A few weeks before he left for Far East for his Bangkok trip, there was a mild flare-up of talk against hermits. It was a new thing then, was coming back. You see, Merton studied history, and that's how he discovered that the hermit thing was part of our tradition. It died out somewhere in all the trouble we've been through, French Revolution and wars and what all. And he proved it was part of the traditional ascesis of the monastic life. Well, then once that was clear, there was no problem. But it took a while to prove all that. Anyway, every now and then it would become an issue in public, and he discussed it with some of them. He didn't hesitate to inform them. If they didn't want him around here, there were other places he could go, and he'd be welcome, which was quite true. There were plenty of places would be glad to have him. And that some of these champions of the cenobitic life weren't exactly models, of course, was something he didn't miss. Not that this embittered him, but it hurt him. In terms of his service to the community, it was shabby treatment. But that wasn't the point. He wasn't asking for the hermit life as a reward for services rendered. He thought and maintained it was simply part of the Cistercian tradition, and he was right. And then eventually the abbot went to Rome, and in the general chapter prevailed upon the abbots to vote it into law that an abbot could have hermits in his community. Not a very practical man. Brothers often were amused by him. He couldn't drive. You know, he wasn't handy with tools. Although he loved the woods, he was dangerous with an axe. You know, wasn't very good at cooking. That's why in the beginning the abbot insisted he come down for dinner every day, so he'd get something to eat at least once a day. In the end, his hermitage was rather adequate. A long living room in front with a big fireplace and big windows, and in the back a bedroom and a kitchen. It was only last year that he got a chapel with a bathroom. Up until then he had a privy out in the woods. And then on Sundays he'd come down to give the monks a talk, usually on a literary subject, Sunday afternoon. Not all would go, 25 or 30. They're in tape now, and they're bestsellers, because he was excellent in commenting on literary figures and their work. The brothers, I could tell you a little side story. The brothers used to go 4 o'clock in the morning after their their Mass and Communion, they go down to the workroom and get the vegetables ready for dinner. Cut up the potatoes or the onions or the cabbage or whatever. It was about 150 monks, so it was quite a bit of work. But eventually, they thought the cooks ought to do it. What did they do all morning? And they began not to show up. Meanwhile, they'd read a pious book. So they stopped skipping it. They started to skip it. Let the cooks do it. And in order to encourage them to come back, the father who was in charge of the brothers went to Merton and asked him if he could record his talk to the novices every morning at 11:30. Sure. So one morning we come in, he said, well, we're on the air. There's a mic hanging in front of him. But I said, well, who are you talking to? To the brothers. Well, the brothers were out in the field. It's going to be recorded. Recorders were fairly new then. It was a novelty in the house. So they'd record his talk, and then tomorrow they'd play it 4 o'clock in the morning to the brothers. And they all came back. They wanted to hear him because we had two divisions, the white monks and the brown, and they were separate. And so they had no contact with Merton. You couldn't talk to him. You couldn't go to confession to him. And they never heard him except 3 or 4 times a year in a public sermon. So he might as well have been in Syracuse as far as being anything to the brothers. And that was the first time they could come in contact with his stuff. He was good material. And by the time he died, they had a whole steel cabinet full of those big 6-inch green tapes, you know, from the old recorders. Priceless. I have suspicion that Merton knew that one day they'd be valuable. He never said that, and none of us dreamed that. We thought they'd be just for us. You know, well, once he was dead, they started to release them, and they're still going strong. Thousands of them. In the original first set that came out were edited because he would hem and haw, and he'd make funny noises and interruptions, and there'd be questions and answers, and they would clean all that up and just leave pure text. But after a couple of years of that, National Catholic Reporter became the agents, and they said, leave them alone. They didn't touch them. They left them intact with all the noises and interruptions, and they sound much more real then. And they're excellent, you know. He was very obedient. Dom James Fox, who didn't hand out compliments that easily, told me he was the most obedient monk in the monastery, which was his salvation, because he was an inspired man, full of ideas, inspirations, and imagination, but as docile as a child. The test of the true monk, if the man of God, is his obedience. You know, because temptation always is for such endowed souls, such richly, endowed people, to believe in their own spirit. And if you don't agree with it, the hell with you. And they go off on their own. All heresies start that way. Somebody gets, usually a very fine man, very brilliant, gets a brilliant idea, but it's slightly warped. And rather than submit, if he submits it to authority, they say, nix. No, they go off on their own, and then they lose the gift. It goes up in smoke. Merton was endowed with the grace of God, that he was rich, you know, in his inspiration and in his imagination, and he'd come up with a new idea every week. Wear out the abbot, you know, with his plans and dreams and so on. And the abbot would listen patiently, you know, like a trout fisherman. You know, you spot the trout and you cast for him, and he takes it, and then you give him line. You feed him line, and the trout goes half a mile down the river. And then finally you say, okay, come on back, honey. And then you... And I say Dom James would have made a marvelous trout fisherman, because he would feed the line to Merton, and then after a while he'd say, no. And Merton would dry his tears and go back to work. Remarkable.